Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 44 of the Future of Work show. Now, if you've been following us for a while, you know we have amazing guests, and we've had amazing guests for now the almost 2 years that this series has been running. We've had thought leaders from across the world. Some have been academics, others have been entrepreneurs. And in today's show, we're going to speak to an amazing entrepreneur and someone who actually I've been following for a while, who's doing work that is absolutely at the cutting edge of her field. But before I bring you on, a little bit about Uncube. Uncube is a research and advisory firm around the future of work. If you are interested in some of the ideas that are changing the world, follow us on LinkedIn, follow our LinkedIn Uncube page as well. We write articles, newsletters based on our own research of shifting employee expectations, shifting organizational expectations, and the ideas that are changing the way we work together. So, with that, let me introduce you to our guest today, Anu Acharya. Hi, Anu. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Shalini. It's an honor to be on your show. It's
Oh,
a fascinating and amazing show.
such a privilege to have you, Anu. So, a little bit about Anu. Besides being super, super smart, I mean, just look at her track record. She has both an undergrad and a postgrad from IIT Kharagpur, and then she went to University of Chicago to do a second master's. She's also done some work with the Kennedy School at Harvard. So, super smart entrepreneur as well. So, Anu, super excited to have you and would love to understand a little bit about, what got you interested. You work in such an interesting area, genome mapping and its implications for both preventive health and more, which we're going to talk about.
So I think like you mentioned, I graduated from IIT. I went to the US and I was working for a startup. And I think this was the time when it was the first wave of startups in some sense in the US. And we thought of many different ideas. I think we started a few things. But around 97, 98, we were basically, one of our co-founders who eventually became co-founder in Osimum, she had suggested this bioinformatics and mapping of genomes. So she was the one who introduced me to this concept. And around the same time, also, the Human Genome Project was getting completed. So around 2000, 2001 was when it finally got completed. And it seemed very exciting. It seemed like something that could open a possibility for the future. And I thought that, if we want to do something and you want to give up our jobs and really put our hearts and souls into a particular area, I think genome mapping seemed like a great area to be. So we packed up our bags, moved to India, and that's when my first company Osimum was founded. And it went through a very fascinating journey. We went through a very fascinating journey because it was the start of something new worldwide. And we were in a country like India, which did not have a lot of the advanced courses that were there. So we started that way. And I remember at that point, it was very, very difficult to get people who knew anything about this space. Because when you are starting something new, you want to find the right people, and getting that was a difficult thing to do. But we were able to do that. We found innovative ways to create that models of training people, getting people on board. But we also got people from across the world. And we created, I think, which became one of the largest genomic services companies worldwide. We did 3 acquisitions. We did 2 rounds of financing. So in some ways, I think a very unusual path to get to where we were, but it was a fascinating and exciting path as well. But I think there was one thing that was bothering me, and I think that was that like in most of medicine, the data that was used to power the basically decision making that you're doing was very skewed, right? So you have a lot of genomic data was being created, but was being created for basically a lot of the Caucasian male that was there. And so I said, we are one of the largest in this space. We are well equipped in terms of understanding the technology. But if we don't look at the Indian genome and do something about it, then who will, right? So I think that those questions that came in were the ones that sort of got me excited about doing something on the direct to consumer genomics model as well. And in 2013, we started Mapmygenome. So
I'm going to ask you to back up just a little bit and explain to me and our viewers really the promise which the Genome Project held. Because I remember the amount of excitement when, that project was nearing completion, and just as you spoke about, just the possibilities that arose. Would love to hear like what some of those possibilities were that got you excited. What were the original possibilities behind your first organizations, and maybe how some of that itself has shifted over the last now, what, almost 20 years, is it?
true. From the time we first the human genome
Yeah.
was completed. So I think initially, when we look at what you could do and where we are today, I think the human genome offered a possibility of being able to look at your entire genome as like what I call as the software of life, right? So if you had to create a book and you sort of now have a book that sort of is like an instruction manual of how to create people, right? In a
Yeah.
very simplistic manner. And here was the first instruction manual of human beings in some form, right? So you had all these letters that were there, and instead of A to Z, you had letters that are A, T, G, and C, and you could now see different chapters or chromosomes, and you could see the paragraphs which are your genes. So you could now have a way of being able to identify everything that was there, and you had some sense of what which genes are causing what, I mean, which mutations are causing what, and so on. So initially the promise was more to be able to understand it from, can we understand the role of each gene, what they do in terms of how the human body functions and all that. So a lot of it that we did in the beginning, for instance, in Osimum, which was my first company, was to be able to help enable that research, right? So we would work with a lot of the large pharmaceutical and biotech companies to be able to help in that research process. We then came to a point where this data started to become more exciting from a medical perspective, right? So the possibilities that you could look at would be more like, one, we can understand if somebody is at risk of a particular disease. Second is to be able to understand, if I want to treat someone, what are the kind of genotypes or people that would respond well to a particular drug or not. You could also understand if what you could do with that information. So treatment, understanding if it's going to be toxic for somebody, or you could understand saying that for different populations, different kinds of drugs are likely to work, and so on. So I remember back in 2008, 9, 10, and so on, we used to do a lot of research for the large pharmaceutical companies, where we did, along with the regular clinical trials that they were doing, we would also run their genomic data on those samples that were coming in. And that was mostly to understand at that point, to see if there were certain clusters of people that would respond well to these drugs or not, right? So it was mostly understanding it from a gene expression, but also genotyping. I'll explain what those terms are. But so initially it was more to understand it from that perspective. And then we started to see that once you start to decode those letters of your life, you started to understand what each of these markers are likely to indicate in terms of your own human health. The other interesting thing is that what your genome can tell is also about where you came from, right? So in your little decoded book of life, when you decode your own, it can tell you where your ancestors came from, what path did they traverse, and what your population mix is. So I think what is interesting, and I think we can maybe talk a little bit more about that, was to be able to understand what our heritage is all about, right? So that could be another area that we're looking at. I think as we move forward, and what we are seeing with the genomics space is that, one, of course, your health will become more precise, right? How do you tackle it from a preventative point of view to understand you're at risk? can I help you and create a plan of action for you? That would be from a prevention point of view. The second is on the cures, right? So you're saying that I want, you have a disease or I have some problem. How do I cure this? Do I have a precise way of dealing with that, right? What will work for me? What won't work for me? But the other, and I think where we are headed towards, is the more exciting part of what you can do in terms of can you increase your health span in some form, right? Can you live longer? Can you become more young? Can you become younger? You don't have, will you not age? So there are lots of these questions that I think are fascinating because genomics is sort of the base. It helps you in understanding so much more than you would if you did not have that information. And I think we are blessed that we are born in that time frame where we have so much information about the human genome, and that helps us in multiple areas that are there in terms of where we will go towards the future. But it's also a time that we don't know everything about it. So it's a great time because you have the right leads and you have the right way of saying, I know there is a path over here, but in the future this is going to be much more found in everything that we do when it comes to our health, nutrition, fitness, and other things. So I gave you a long
Wow.
rounded answer,
Yeah,
but
no, not long rounded, but there's a lot of information in that to unpack. So I'm going to take that one by one. And we're going to start with, the idea of what information is revealed in our DNA. And I think that's the idea behind Genome Patri. So, by the way, I love the name. It's just so beautiful. So, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about Genome Patri, which I know is one of your flagship products. How does it really work? What can it tell you? What does it not tell you as well? What are some of those limitations to what we can read into our DNA data? And uh, you know, what is it that is determined by other factors, perhaps?
sure. So Genome Patri is a product that we've created so that people can actually, they can be sitting in any part of the world, and we can ship a kit to them so that we can collect uh, DNA from them. So maybe I can show you what we
Yeah,
ship out.
please.
Yeah. So this, I don't know, that is
Yeah,
a little box that you get, and then you open this up. You can see there is like a booklet over here, and then inside that, oops, I don't know. Yeah,
yeah,
this is a little swab kit, and I think thanks to COVID, all of us are familiar with what a. Uh, so you can see this. There's little liquid over here, and there's a little like a toothbrush in some form, but a toothbrush not to brush your teeth, but to brush your cheeks. And then you take a little swab and you put it back in there, and then that sample is sent back to us. So that's basically the sample that we would collect, and anybody can essentially do this in their homes. What this is doing is, when I mentioned earlier, there was like a book of life, right? So in genopathy, what we are doing is we don't sequence the entire genome, which we can do, of course, we can do a whole genome, but we would look at all the important markers that are there. So if you think about it, for instance, like if you there is the Mahabharat, the full Mahabharat or the entire Gita, and then you have an abridged version, right, which tells you the most important things that are there. Right?
highlight
So
reel.
highlights, right? So you are basically, those are the things that you will are important at this point, and in the genome space, those are the markers that are well understood already, right? So you look at markers that are there across the genome, and we are able to take that. What we then give people a report on would be a detailed report on what kind of traits are you likely to have. Now you would have noticed that everybody is different when it comes to how they react to different kinds of foods, how they learn things, how they how they react to alcohol, how they so that is one part which we call traits, right? Are likely to have curly hair, straight hair, all fun. Some of them are fun things, some of them are behavioral things, and then some of them are more, I would say, nutrition and fitness related activities. So that we would consider that as traits, right? The second is to understand it from a relative risk, right? So if I consider someone like me who has a family history of diabetes. Do I have a risk for diabetes or not? Then you look at things like cardiovascular diseases. You look at risk for cancers, and you look at several other disease risks. But it's a risk. It's not a diagnosis. Yeah. So one is that we look at the second part, which is the risk. The third area that we look at is more like trying to understand if you have a carrier, if you're a carrier of a particular genetic disorder like phenylketonuria or G6PD. Because if you then do have a child with somebody who also has that marker, the chances of passing it on to the child it increases quite significantly. And then the fourth is where you're trying to understand what sort of drugs are going to work for me. Are they going to be effective? Is that dose going to be effective? Second is this going to be toxic, right? So if you think about it from a simplistic manner, I think you have drugs like metformin that almost every diabetic uses, for instance, but 30% of the people are not likely to respond well to it. So I think it is to be able to understand why you might be responding well to a drug versus not. Right? So you get a full 100+ page report, which is quite detailed. It will tell you that these are the things that you can, these are the markers, this is what you're likely to be at risk of based on the population that you belong to. So it will say that in India, 1 out of 5 is likely to be at risk for diabetes. You are at either 0.5x of that, or you are twice likely to be at risk for it. So that would be one thing. But that is just the first thing that you get. Then we take a lot of information in terms of their lifestyle and their health history. And then a genetic counselor will take those two pieces together. And now we've also added biochemistry to it. So you take these pieces of information and then assess, has that risk increased or decreased based on that. So if you are, let's say, at risk for type 2 diabetes, but your HbA1c is fine, and you are regularly exercising, your food looks good, then your risk is somewhat reduced, right? But if it's the other way around, then it gets increased. So this is the kind of information that you would get, and then you get an action plan, which would basically say that, these are the things that you should be aware of, right? That in this particular condition where you have a high risk, what should you be aware of? And then we'll tell them these are the kind of symptoms, these are the kind of foods that are likely to, lifestyle modifications that are good for you, and then also some information on what kind of screening tests are likely to be good for you. And then we tell them, take this to your medical doctor, show them this report, and now you can plan what you need to do from that point onwards. So a lot of the people who get these tests would be healthy people. At this point, everything looks good, but maybe there's a lot of things underneath that people haven't been able to understand that. So that's what we are. That's what we would offer in a genome patri, where people can actually find out and get an action plan on what they can do after they get a report and a session and a counseling session.
No, that is super helpful because I love the way that you are bringing in both, uh, you know, the lifestyle impact on perhaps the, genetic expression of their DNA, and how the two sort of come together to give a much better rounded picture of, where they're at in terms of their risk factors. So I'm going to take a question or two. There's a question from Anshuman. Hi, Anshuman. Thanks for joining. Anshuman's question is this: mapping the genome could also make editing it possible, right? That could mean we can eradicate cancer and other diseases in the future. Your views?
So I think Anshuman, the question that he's asking, one is, of course there is a possibility of editing, and everybody's now heard about CRISPR-Cas, which is a more popular genome editing tool that is there. There have been tools to edit earlier as well, but this has become a very simple way of editing. At the same time, I think CRISPR, so you can do two things with it. One is, can you treat somebody for their lifetime, right? So let's say if I have a disease that is either causing me vision loss or something like that, if I can treat that patient for their lifetime for that specific disease, using some sort of editing possibilities. I think that for that person, I think depending on whether that has passed through regulatory approvals, I think that is one way of doing it. And there are lots of companies working on genome editing therapies that are there. So that is one, but it only affects, let's say, if I'm the one getting the treatment, it doesn't affect my children or anybody else. And I think that is far more easier to comprehend in terms of what the possibilities may be for the future, versus if you can make those editing changes in the embryo, right? So if you are looking at it from making changes in the embryo, then there might be things that we are not aware of, right? But you have made a change for the rest of the progeny that is coming for that. And I think that is where a lot of the ethical and legal debates are on. There was one child there were, I think, in China that already happened a few years ago. But I think these are the things that we fully don't understand, and which is why I think it's something that we have to be careful about. But at the same time, I think it offers, like every technology, it offers you possibilities that were never there before. And how we use it as humanity, I think it depends on us, not just from one nation to the other, because I think the world is a global it's too global. So if one country has it, it will probably be there in some form or the other to everybody else. So CRISPR and other gene editing tools are fantastic. It gives us possibilities that we never did. But at the same time, I think in some ways it's like acting God. You're playing with the way nature was meant to be. Right? So I think it depends on how this whole shapes up from a scientific, legal, and regulatory perspective. But I think the possibilities are endless.
I know, is this already like sort of, is this being done at least on a test basis, editing people's genome to eradicate cancer that they already have, for instance? Or
So there are lots of gene therapies that are already approved, right? So if you look at some of the, I think there have been maybe more than, I think the last I read was about 300, 400 patients that have already gotten some form of, some of the, and I think many more now. So there are some different kinds of therapies that are there. So you have some therapies that are there for cancer, like CAR T therapies, you have immunotherapies, and you have a lot of these therapies that have been used for a lot of patients across the world. And then there are some therapies that actually have got FDA approval as well, right? But those are for a very specific condition. So these are already there. But editing it on the embryo basis, not there, right? I think that is not yet approved. And I think that requires a lot more debate and thought before that can be allowed.
yeah.
But you also have found that CRISPR became a fascinating tool to come up with diagnostics, for instance. During COVID, we found that there were a lot of CRISPR-based tools that allowed us to be quickly come up with a diagnostic tool that is there, because you can now specifically edit that specific part of that genome. In this case, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? So I think the technology that can allow us to do many different things. Some parts, the single gene disorders which have a specific gene therapy have gone through approvals, and I think we're starting to see many more coming our way. And some parts that I think we still have to figure out what we can do as a human race when it comes to what the future is going to be.
Yeah, that's a question we're going to come to towards the end of the show, because there's just so many possibilities, good and not so good. So, it's a huge question. I'm going to take a look at some of the other questions. Srivatsa asks, are the genome patri attributes for a person qualitative, or will they have a number associated for each risk? For example, risk of diabetes on a scale of 1 to 10, or more qualitative?
So what we would show would more be a relative risk, right? So it will be a number, but it will be a relative risk. So for instance, and I said that it will show you two columns. It will say the population risk. So let's say if you take something like AMD, which is your age-related macular degeneration, it'll show, let's say, a number like 1 in 5 or one, whatever, some number that is there for the Indian population. Then it'll give you a number that will say that you might be at 1.7 times that risk for the average. Now, so you can calculate, it is a number, but we made it simple enough for people to understand. And then we flag it, so it'll say high, low, medium, but it'll also give you a number. Then we, when the genetic counselor talks to the person, we would then say, if I take this information, what does this really mean, right? So if you had, let's say, a condition which was 1 in 100,000, so it's a rare condition in general. So even if you are at twice the risk, the chances of you getting it are low, but are higher compared to the average. So I think the genetic counselor looks at their family history, looks at all of that, and explains to them what that really means, right? What does that number mean? And what is, in certain diseases, the heritability is high, in some cases the heritability is low, right? So I think that's the kind of information that you would get during a counseling session to help them understand what does this really mean for them. So yes, it is a number, but it's a number which is relative.
I know a little while back you spoke about mapping heritage. And I know that, in countries like the United States, this has been, something that many people have done to just partly out of curiosity, partly it's just become a really fun thing to talk about, right? That this percentage of my heritage seems to be country X or region X, perhaps, and region Y. You mentioned in one of our earlier conversations that you're also seeing some of that interest in India, which I was actually, to be honest, a little surprised by, because, we sort of imagined that India has had fewer waves of migration, but would love to understand from you, the interest in heritage, and what are some of the interesting things that you're finding?
Sure. So I think, when we consider America, it is a recent wave of immigrants, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who have gone to America, maybe 100 years old, like 100, 200 years old. When we look at India, I think there are many more. We have had a lot of people conquer us. We have gone into many different countries, and so there have been an exchange and a migration, for sometimes for knowledge, sometimes for, as kings that have gone and conquered different places. So there are quite interesting things that have happened in India. It's just that I think we were sort of told that, we know everything about our last 7 generations. And so, for instance, I was told that everything about our family is there in Haridwar. You go over there and you find out everything in 7 generations. So I think that's great documentation. But I think when you do a heritage or a genetic analysis, what you will find is that, I'm from Rajasthan, so there will be influence from Central Asia, Pakistan, and that area that you will find in my genome. But you might also find something interesting, other interesting things from other countries that you will find that there is commonality. We found, for instance, someone who's a resident of Kerala, who thought family was completely from Kerala, to find some Pathan genes and so on. So I think our Indian genome is quite fascinating, and we found some people from Bengal or from other places. Even in our own company, we found that there was someone who said he found something which said some large percentage Maharashtrian, but he was obviously born from Telangana. And then he found out that his mother was, or grandmother was from Maharashtra, and he never knew about it, or he never consciously thought about it, right? So I think it is just trying to understand it from that point of view, and it allows us to be able to understand so much about other cultures, because that curiosity in us, in where we came from, I think is universal. And it is just that, we always thought that maybe we didn't have, that interesting a history, but actually we do. And I think what understanding it from a heritage point of view helps you to know is that maybe there are things about our history and where we came from and why we are, a certain way, could depend on what happened to our ancestors, right? Because that information has been passed on with some changes as we went along. But I think DNA is that one piece of information that I think can sort of defy in many ways even history books or what you were told as word of mouth. But what it also reveals, and I think which is one of the reasons I love looking at DNA so much, is that everybody is still 99.9% alike, right? So all the human created barriers of caste, gender, religion, and all of that is a little, I think, outdated when you start looking at it from a DNA lens. We are very similar, and yet we are unique. And I think that's hopefully the message that we can spread across the world with that.
That's such a beautiful message, Anu. That's such a beautiful message. In fact, my sister did, I think, an ancestry project. So she lives in the US. And she was surprised to find that a very large part, overwhelming part, actually was from Central Asia. So which we'd never quite, consciously thought of. And it was, okay, sort of makes sense because we're from undivided Pakistan at one point in time. But, it's just fascinating when you read that. And I guess when I use some of your Genome Patri, I'll probably learn something interesting about myself. I'm going to just take a few questions. Papia, hi. Papia asked, does the Genome Patri also talk about personality traits or habits?
It does, but to a limited extent. I think there are some personality traits that are not yet have a very strong statistical significance. So our head of bioinformatics is not going to allow some of that in place, right? But they may be added as we get more evidence. So we do have some personality traits like. Are you likely to, for instance, how you learn, right, from memory, from are you going to learn from mistakes? Are you resilient? So there are some of those that are definitely covered, and we are planning to add more as long as we can find enough of statistical significance for those markers, because you don't want to tell people that something that might not necessarily be so it might be interesting, but if it is not scientifically sound, we wouldn't put that up in our reports. For instance, there are possible ways of saying that singing, for instance, runs in some families, right? I mean, you find that there are certain gharanas and all of that, and you can sort of trace that. But I think we have not yet come to a point where I can pinpoint and say you are likely to be able to be you know a fantastic singer, right? But you can see if there are people who can match tone, for instance. There'll be people like me who will not be able to sing, but I think I can understand music. So I think there are interesting things like that. But I think as we go along in the next few years, we'll start to see much more interesting things about behavior and other personality traits, because there are things like entrepreneurship. Are you likely to be risk taking and things like that that we can look at from a genome pathology or possibly.
How fascinating. Are we any closer to resolving the eternal nature versus nurture debate then?
I think it basically tells us that they're both important, right? Because and I have this conversation with my kids often. So I think I'll take one example. So I have the sprint gene, right? So if you look at the Indian population, I think very few people actually have the sprint gene. Most of them have this, sort of in between. And then there are some who have the endurance gene. So I had this conversation with, at that point, she was 10 years old. And I told her, she looked at her report and she said, why did I get the sprint gene, for instance, right? So does it mean I can't run? So I said, no, it doesn't mean you can't run. But what it means is that if we both were practicing for 10,000 hours, for instance, to run for the Olympics in a 100-meter dash, then if we both did exactly the same things, I would have an advantage over you on if we did that. But clearly, I'm not running, I'm not practicing enough. So it doesn't mean you might still beat me at this point of time, right? So I think when you look at nature versus nurture, what it basically helps you to understand is if the nurture is exactly the same for two people, then then it will matter what your genetic risks are going to say. And similarly, the other way around, right? So if you had exactly the same genetic markers, but you're brought up differently, I think your process of being what you actually end up doing will be different. So there are influences of both, and it's important to understand. And I often tell people this is like an equation, a linear equation, right? So you have the constants, which are your genetic markers, but what you can change is what you can do with your own life. And I think that helps you to understand that there's some things that you were born with. You shouldn't blame your ancestors for the genes they gave you, for instance, because there are a lot of things you can do about it. But it helps you to understand what are my limitations in terms of understanding what I need to do. Do I need to work harder at a certain thing? Do I need to, pursue a different path, and so on? The other way to think about this could be, by looking at it as a Google Maps or something, right? Because it helps you to sort of uh, get to the same place, but it guides you towards a certain way of how do you reach that goal. Maybe you don't go the same straight path that you always thought you should go to, but you have to take a slightly different path. So that's, I think, in many ways is the nature versus nurture thing. That I think now we understand what nature is doing for us. I think it's easier for us to change the way we work with our own lifestyle. So I think that's what it is. So it's not a yes or no answer. It's helping people understand or know themselves a little better.
I love the way you're explaining this as, almost a linear equation, because that makes a lot of sense. You have the constants that, is sort of the card you're dealt with, and then there's everything else about what you make of it and what you do with that. Just a fun story, many years back, my son started running, and he did really well actually, and he was part of his athletics team at school, and was competing quite successfully. And we were really surprised because nobody in our family had been a runner or, frankly, terribly athletic either. So both my husband and I, at that point in time, we started running because we felt, okay, someone has to have passed on the genes to him. If he is a runner, perhaps one of us. So anyway, it wasn't me. That we sort of figured out fairly early on. But my husband discovered running because of the fact that my son could run. And so we sort of reverse engineered and said, okay, if he can run, then maybe one of us has the genes for it. I'm going
It's
to
true.
take a look.
It does come from
Yeah,
somewhere. Yeah, yeah.
correct. Um, Trisha asks a question. Can the genome mapping help me in figuring out what problems or diseases my child can have?
Yes, absolutely. I think it will give you a risk. So it is a probability. Like I mentioned, there's the nature and the nurture. So it'll tell you that maybe they're at risk for a certain kind of disease. And it also depends on whether you want to know that information upfront, especially for some later stage conditions. If you do want to know, I think what you can do is to make those changes upfront without maybe the child even knowing why those changes have been made, right? Or you can have a discussion. So it depends on families. We found both kinds of families. Some that want to discuss and talk about what the risks are and what you can do. And, when we had first started Mapmygenome, the Genome Patri in 2013, and we were having this little party, and a lot of kids were there. And one of our team members went and sat, was listening to the conversation the kids were having. And in those kids, some of them were my kids, and there were other kids that were there. And they were discussing about, risks of colon cancer and risks of something else very calmly, right? So it was like the kids, it didn't matter, it was not like they were afraid of discussing a risk. But I think a lot of people in our generation, for instance, might not be as open as discussing that easily with other people. But so it depends on families, but you can certainly find out if you are at risk for particular disease. And then especially when you correlate that and you have a genetic counseling session, it helps you to understand if you can put that information together and what you can do about it today, right? Instead of waiting for it to manifest in some form. So I think that's what it can help. You either discuss it and you do it, or you make changes in terms of lifestyle for the whole family. That sort of already, because if it's a risk that is there for your child, it's possible that you also have that risk, like you've discovered with running.
Thank you. Um, Srivatsa has a comment. Vasudev Kutumbam can be truly enlightened by Genome Patri, discovering self among others in the universe. How lovely.
Yeah. Actually, that's
Papia,
something we
yeah,
use
go ahead.
a lot in our advertising actually now.
Oh,
The
how
we are
lovely.
so I'm so happy to hear that from one of the guests. So.
Uh, Varsha asks a question. Does this process help cure cancer without having to undergo chemotherapy?
So it doesn't help in curing, right? But it helps in preventing if you can. So I think what people don't realize is that a lot of you know, it is either help you in prevention or early detection. Let me put it that way. Right. So it'll help you in identifying if there's a risk. And for instance, I think people who are at risk for lung cancer, 50% of your risk will coming from smoking and other activities that if you are at risk, then then if you're smoking, I think you're at a much higher risk than if you did not smoke, right? So I think it helps you in understanding that. Or it helps you, for instance, let's say if you are at risk for breast cancer, and breast cancer is fully treatable as long as you go and get it treated early stages. So one is that you can make lifestyle changes. The second is that you can actually do a very early detection and therefore be able to get treated. The problem today with cancer, especially, is that a lot of times, by the time they go to see a doctor, by the time they even get a diagnostic test or anything like that, it is a bit too late. So, according to one study and I'm happy to pass those references on, but 50% of the cancers are preventable. But many of them, I think, if you look at what has happened in the US, because of the large number of genetic tests, I think the early detection of cancers has gone up so high that breast cancer is almost the people actually suffering from it has reduced very very dramatically. And I think that's mostly awareness, and also I think somebody who's paying for those tests as well. I think that's a key in terms of how do you get to a point where everybody can have access to these tests and be able to know themselves and be able to get an early detection, if not prevent a particular disease, including cancer.
I'm going to take a comment. I noticed Genome Patri kit is also available on Amazon, but the public may not be self-motivated to get a genome screening unless prescribed or suggested by a physician. Is Mapmygenome making any attempt to promote the genetic screening through physicians, like before prescribing a medication for chronic conditions? Actually, I'd love you to speak a little bit about, personalized medicine as well.
Sure. So we do work with a lot of doctors. We do work with, for instance, you can get it in Apollo clinics. You can get it in many of the hospitals that are there right now that we work with in Hyderabad, in Delhi, and Bangalore. We now have physical labs also in all these in these locations, and we'll be adding more as well. So yes, we do work a lot with physicians, and it's not just for genome patri. We also do a lot of actual, let's say, work on cancer and on prenatal and postnatal diagnostics as well. So I think while we are very well known for genome patri and that we can order it online, I think it is available through hospitals and clinics and doctors and all also. And I think that when we can get it to more doctors, I think it will become it'll definitely see a lot more acceptance. So, for instance, I think someone mentioned the Amazon. I think what we see is that a large number of people on Amazon buy the heritage product, right, which is finding out who they are.
How
So
interesting.
it is quite a fascinating, number. So we see the maximum number is heritage, then it is genome patri, and then it is the fitness and wellness, and so on. So we have products for these different categories. So I think Amazon is just one of the channels that we have, but we do, we are hoping that a lot of companies can make it available to their employees. and we've had some companies that have made it available to their employees as well. So because in and hoping that there are other ways that people can pay for these things. So if they don't pay for that themselves, that if some sponsor like their HR or an insurance company or somebody who's willing to sponsor it for them, I think it gives people the ability to know that better. So yes, we do partner with a lot of medical doctors on oncology, mother and child, and also genome patri, and we are working with companies and others to enable this. The second thing, and you asked, is about precision medicine and do we get doctors to do that? So we've created, for instance, Medica Map, which is basically in genome patri we do only 10 or 15 drugs, common drugs. In Medica Map we look at more than 100 drugs, right? So it sort of covers the entire spectrum of drugs that you can look at in terms of both in terms of toxicity but also in terms of efficacy. And this is a product that's very popular with the medical professionals because it helps them to identify, for instance, if you take psychiatrists, right, a lot of times you are spending weeks and months in trying to just figure out what drug is likely to work for their patient. This will help them very quickly understand. And now we've also reduced the time it takes for you to get this report. Typically, it used to be 6 to 8 weeks. Now we typically do it in 2 3 weeks. So it allows you to be able to get that information, create that profile for your patients, and then be able to prescribe the right kind of drugs for that specific patient. So when you look at it from a precision medicine perspective, I think understanding this, and we look at only the drugs that have that the US FDA, for instance, has given said that this is something that you can use from a genotype to understanding whether that drug is working for this person or not. I think that's what we're using, and we use some guidelines that allow doctors to be able to say what kind of dosage is good. So we wouldn't do the dosage and other things because that the medical professional does, but we do give them the guidelines that allow them to be able to understand what can be done about it. So that's where a lot of precision medicine is headed. Uh, but there are two things. One is you want to look at it from understanding it from your the genetic hereditary point of view to understand if a drug is likely to work for you or not. And the second is when, for instance, you are a cancer patient, then what we would do is we would take that tissue sample from that particular patient and then run it to see if we can, if there's a specific thing that specific drug or something that would work for them. So I think there are different parts of what we are seeing today in precision medicine. And I think going forward, there will be more information that we will get because there are other interactions of many kinds, right? So there are drug-drug interactions, there's drug-food interactions, there's multiple interactions that are happening. And one of the things we have to, I think we will figure out over the next few years is how do we put all those pieces of information together for the patient to understand and for the doctor to sort of understand as well. So a lot is happening. I think data and machine learning is what is going to drive a lot of the field of genomics forward as well.
That's absolutely fascinating. How far are we in its popular usage, though? Like, if I go to say a leading hospital in a big city, what's the likelihood that the doctor who's treating me would have an understanding of how precision medicine works, and how mainstream is it as yet, and how much is it still probably for the front runners in the field?
So I think in some areas, for instance, a lot of gynecologists are familiar with genetic testing because if you had to divide it up into the kinds of genetic tests that are there, you would have the prenatal sort of tests, right? So I think NIPT, for instance, has found a fair amount of coverage across the gynecologists and others. So here you're actually trying to find out if the fetus, if you're having any specific genetic abnormality, that is there. So you would look at that, and because it's done with the mother's blood, I think it has gained fair amount of acceptance. Before that, if you are thinking about, if you want to get, if two people are deciding to have a baby together, you could do a carrier screen, right? So you would do a carrier screen where you look at all the possible conditions that you're a carrier of, and then put that together and see if there's a possibility of passing some of that to your children. I think a lot of gynecologists are also familiar with that, but not everybody prescribes that, right? And then the third would be a newborn screen, for instance. So in the newborn screen, you would test a baby. Typically, you would do that either with a biochemical test, but then take it, if there is something that you detect, you would do a genetic test. That I think currently we have found that it's not a large population that gets that, but it has seen an increased number of babies that are being given the initial screening. In countries like the UK, they screen the entire population. In India, I think we are still the newborn screening. I think now the government has created a lot of programs around it. So I'm hoping that that will start seeing more of what we see in the newborn screening in the years to come. The third would be, do you understand it from a pediatric point of view, right? And I think pediatricians, neurologists, at least the good ones, I think all of them are familiar with, let's say, a child is having epilepsy or something like that. How do you understand and all of that? So they know that there is a genetic basis. And some doctors would use it, others might not use it based on the kind of profile of customers that they get. And then you have cancer doctors or oncologists. I think this is where they can find so much value in doing genetic testing. While that number is growing, I think we will have to make them cheaper. So we've created, for instance, a targeted NGS panel called DNA OncoNext, and we did that because we realized that one of the reasons, of course, there's awareness, there is all of that, but one of the reasons that doctors were not prescribing a genetic test in the beginning was the cost, right? So they were trying everything else, and they come to to a genetic test in the end. So we said maybe if we can create something that's of value for them, we'll make it low cost. Then can it be used for everybody? And I think that was the reason we said we'll create this low cost cancer panel that we can sequence very deeply and be able to offer that. So I think we find that to be become quite valuable amongst the doctors. The other interesting thing is that a lot of doctors have done the test for themselves, which is a good sign.
That's a
And
great start.
yeah, and I think as the price point is going down, I think people are willing to offer it to their customers because they don't want to be known as the doctor that prescribed an expensive test also.
Yeah, yeah. So, Anu, I realize we are getting towards the end of time, but I can't leave without asking you about the downsides of it. One of the things we speak about a lot on this show actually is, technology and ideas that are changing this world. And as we enter what's so popularly called, the fourth industrial revolution, where there are, several fields where technology, and in this case, for instance, genome mapping is opening out possibilities that simply did not exist, a couple of decades ago, or perhaps even a decade back. All these shifts are coming together at a time which is going to transform the way businesses work, the way we live our lives, and the way perhaps governments formulate strategy and regulatory make regulatory choices. So, what do you think are some of the risk factors associated with the extensive use of genome mapping? Where could things go wrong? And what do you think would be some important pieces that regulators, whether it's global regulators or country-wise regulators, need to be conscious of?
So I think one an important thing is when you look at genetic tests, I think there are few factors that will sort of one is to be able to see it from a lens of somebody who is a patient, right? So you're a patient, you're getting that information. Now, if the data is not shared across multiple different places, maybe we might not have the you might not have the most accurate data that is there, right? So one is that I think as we go along, I think we have to find means of creating some sort of a regulation around how do you interpret this data globally, not in
Yeah.
one place or the other, but globally create these standards. But these standards will be created only when you have enough data of every population type and you're able to create those. So one is, I think there is a need to be able to create some sort of a globalized standards of interpretation of this data. That is one. The second is, and I think these are laws that are already out there in most parts of the world, is how do you ensure that this data is private, right? So I think people, for instance, will not want to share their own genetic data with, let's say, their employer or an insurance company and so on. I think in most cases, like even with us, we don't share it with the end, with an insurance company or they might still sponsor it because they see downside benefits to it. But I think that is an important aspect, that if you are sharing data with somebody, that should not hurt that individual, right? So, and what I mean by that is that your private information as to who you are versus anonymized information on what that data can do, I think are two separate things. So, for instance, I think we would not have been where we are today as a human race if the anonymized data wasn't shared, right? So, if you did large study, you shared that data, I think that's valuable for everybody. But it is not correct if let's say they knew what my risks were, and as a result denied me employment or denied me insurance cover that went up or down based on what my genetic risks are. So I think there is a difference between what the data that is anonymized and for the greater good versus data that is private and personalized for a particular individual. And I think that's one of the areas that one needs to differentiate so that we don't confuse that data by default is bad, right? I think it's good from a research perspective, but it's bad if that individual is affected or can be identified based on that data. In most cases, I think if you're doing, for instance, something like a genome patri, we are not like you're not doing everything, but even then, I think you have to make sure that customers' personal information is separate from the other. That is one. The second thing is that we have to also understand that we don't know everything about everything in genomics, and as a
Yeah.
result, I think there has to be a explanation on what does this mean for the average person, and how do you make sure that you're constantly educating the patient, the customer, and so on. So these are some of the challenges that are there. And the third is, I think, like when we mentioned about CRISPR and other newer technologies, we still don't know the what the future is going to bring us. So I think there has to be more deliberation on the futuristic possibilities of technologies. Now, one of the things I think, as human race, we either like dystopian views or utopian views. But the truth is, I think science is actually happens in small steps. But I think as people who get this information, we have seen movies like Gattaca and others that show a dystopian view of the what genomics can bring to you. But the truth is, I think genomics can help us if we believe that we believe in the value of that technology going forward. And if we don't, we can always go the wrong path as humanity. But my faith in humanity is that we won't. So that's
Oh,
what I look at.
no, thank you for sharing that, Anu. In fact, I remember that about maybe a decade back, when some of these possibilities became real, that DNA testing would potentially be able to reveal your risks. And there was a question around, how much of that data would be available to employers? Would that be an ethical practice or not? It's quite, it's quite it's quite a positive thing that a decade later this isn't even a question. At least there's reasonable clarity on the fact that, like you said, personal data is personal, and that's not an area where organizations should at least ethically even consider going. So I think what you're saying is true, that if we look at some of the fears, what we're also seeing is that organizations have chosen to, take the ethical stand. And I think the common worldview that is emerging around many of these, particularly around data and data privacy, is on the right side. But that's not to say that there aren't risks. So absolutely. Anu, I realize we're on the hour. Any last thoughts you'd like to leave our viewers with?
So I think one that DNA, like I mentioned earlier, shows that we are 99.9% alike. But I think it also shows we are unique, and I think we should respect that about every person that we meet. And I think when we start doing that, I think some of the problems that we have created for ourselves as humanity will vanish. And I'm hoping that what we can do with genomics will help us in getting towards better cures, help people to live longer, and to be able to make the right decisions. So I hope that when you look at DNA and other things, you look at it as something that can enable you to know yourself better, but also to be able to respect other people around you who might appear to be different, but it's just that they are similar, but they're unique and bring in a different perspective.
Fascinating conversation, Anu. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me. I know all of us have learned so much from you. If you just look at the comments, it's all about just how much people have learned and how interesting they've found all that you've shared. So with that, thank you so much. We're coming to an end of our show today. But please join us next week, because next week we have an Uncube Unplugged. And an Uncube Unplugged session is largely a Q&A session where me and my co-founder Papia will talk to you about what social capital is and how you can consider rebuilding or even understanding how social capital in your organization has shifted, as all of us have worked remotely, or at least largely remotely, over the last almost 2 years now. So with that, we come to an end of today's show. Have a lovely weekend, and thank you very much.